paving roads. It's government pays for roads and shifts the cost on the taxpayers without shifting the cost necessarily onto drivers. More roads should be in Indiana. They privatized a lot of the roads so that now there's tolls being charged, big tolls being charged to people driving trucks. So that adds a bit to the cost of buying something from across the country, but that's the way a free market would work. So introducing a free market actually means fewer people driving as many miles. It actually could mean more of a local economy, more local manufacturing. I have a few other examples, but I'm running out of time, so I'll save them, but I'll say this. Property rights is a way to get people to take care of their land. A limited government would have stronger local economies. Both of those things would improve the environment. Government is too influenced by special interests to help the environment. And also government inherently is too narrow, doesn't look broad enough, doesn't look at all the costs of its actions. And so its narrow-mindedness, focusing on the emissions here, often makes things worse overall. Thank you.
Hi everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank the Federalist Society for inviting me today. When I was in law school, I used to go to Federalist Society events. I disagreed with a lot of the speakers and their points, but I found that they often had the sharpest exchange of views, and I felt I learned a lot from going to that. And then when I clerked on the Second Circuit, my judge, Ralph Winter Jr., he was the first faculty advisor to the first Federalist Society chapter. He hired me as his clerk that year to be the token lib, the token lefty. And my job was to lose at lunch, right? So we would have the discussions, and this libertarian, smart economist lawyer, Ralph Winter, who knew lots more than I did and was funnier than me and all that stuff. And I was supposed to argue just well enough that he could get some exercise, and then he swapped me away, and that was that. So I've been having fun debating with libertarian, government's always wrong folks for a really long time. And so what I'm going to do is spend the first half of my time roughly talking about the sort of government's always wrong part of what Tim had to say. And then I'm going to talk about climate change and whether we should do government intervention on climate change. So on a number of the things that Tim said work just fine by me. And then there's like a moment in his syllogisms where I go, what? I just don't see where that happens. So step one, Tim's been doing muckraking. He does reporting for the Washington Examiner. He's acting as bringing sunlight to various kinds of sometimes sleazy things out there in the world. This is a really good thing to have happen. People on the left have had their muckrakers over time, and Tim's doing it more from the right. But it's absolutely right that you should spot the sleazy stuff and bring it to the light. Step two, when it's the sleazy stuff, you should also spot the self-interest. So the fact that GE is going to get some goodies out of this, or the fact that somebody's husband's going to make money selling windows, or whatever it is, the examples you use, it's worth spotting the self-interest, because then you have a question. Maybe it's the self-interest that's driving what's going on here. And another thing that Tim does that's not always shared by everybody who critiques the government is that he critiques big business as well. So his list of not so beautiful things, he talked about GE and Alcoa and a bunch of other companies. And that's a key to wisdom, which is government is imperfect. Yes, I agree. Corporations are imperfect. Yes, I agree. And corporations in the marketplace lead to imperfect outcomes also. So we can't just worship if we say the market or we say property rights and therefore think we've got everything right. So the first three steps, let's find out what's going on, let's spot the self-interest, let's blame the different people who are in the midst of causing problems. I agree with all that. And then, I'm going to quote from the point where he was criticizing government and screwing up on Kyoto or environmental, and that is the nature of government environmental regulation, which is basically, we went from those first three things to say that as a category, government environmental regulation screws up, it's too narrow, it's wrong, etc. That's the logical leap where I just didn't hear in what Tim was saying any reason to think that that's true, or any reason to think it's more true of a government solution than all the other possible solutions we have to problems. And so my basic analytic structure is, let's look for environmental and other things at the market failures. Let's look at the various ways markets can go wrong. And then let's also look at the government failures, and let's notice whatever we do, government, market, some combination, anything else you want to do, whatever we do, we're going to have to choose imperfect institutions run by imperfect people. And then we're going to have to somehow struggle through in this fallen state that we're in to whatever it is we're going to do. So with that as a frame, sort of, yeah, we should be skeptical of government, but be skeptical of all the different approaches. Let's try to figure out the right approaches. I'm going to move to some opening discussion about climate change. Now, my big disclaimer here is that I am state-of-the-art on climate change from about 1996, because that's the last time I taught environmental law. And a lot's happened since then, and I have not been an expert in environmental law. But the structures of the arguments are quite similar, and I did some research to try to get ready. But there's lots of facts about climate change. I'm not the guy to tell you what the proportion of man-made contribution to climate change is, but I do have some stuff I've done. So, the basic question, whether it's Kyoto, whether it's cap and trade, whether it's some other action for climate change, the basic question is, do you have action through the political realm, or do you have inaction? And the price of inaction could be New York City and Miami underwater in 30 years. So if we don't do climate change action, if we don't find some way to try to address this very large global thing, the science comes out with sea level rise that's quite substantial. And if you do nothing, Miami's underwater. Now, you might not like Miami, but, you know, and in football, you know, we know that Ohio's better than Miami. But you know, still with all that, we have facts that are happening in the world. Whether you call them government facts or market facts, I'm going to take it as a given that climate change is going ahead. And I'm going to take it as a given that if we take action, we can mitigate. And if we don't take action, it gets worse. Now, those facts might be debatable, and maybe Tim will debate it. Maybe either he thinks that it's not going to happen, climate change, or he thinks that we can't do anything about it. But I'm going to take it that we can. And then the question is, what do we do about it? Should there be a role for government? And another way to say it is, if we have action we can take on climate change, is it worth having an insurance policy in case this climate change stuff is correct? It's really strange if you think there's a pretty big chance your house is going to get hit by fire. It's pretty strange not to try to get fire insurance. And right now we're worrying about the heating up of the fire in the world, and we're saying, should we get insurance against that? Should we take steps to address it or not? And I don't understand in a world of more than 6 billion people, more than 100 countries and all that, how you get coordination across countries in a way that affects climate change unless you have government involved. And by the way, unless you have big business involved. So we're going to need, in order to make it work, to notice all the self-interest. And then we're going to need to figure out how do we harness the self-interest to make it better in an imperfect way rather than worse in an imperfect way. And just saying property rights, or just saying markets, or just saying government screws up is not logically tell you whether you say the heck with it, or whether you say let's try to do the best we can given the tough choices we face. So I think that's a frame on the climate change question. There's a, but I'll say one other, how much time do I have? 2 minutes? More? I can keep talking ad nauseum. Okay,
I'll let you know.
I tend to go short, so that way we'll have more time for discussion. We do have some history of government in the environmental level, in the environmental area. And the history is basically in the early 1970s, the United States passed the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, late 1970s, Superfund, this kind of stuff. And in the late 1990s, a writer named Greg Easterbrook, who's the brother of Judge Easterbrook and Professor Easterbrook from Chicago, Greg Easterbrook wrote a book called A Moment on, no, it's not A Moment on the Earth, what was it called? Maybe it was called A Moment on the Earth, do you remember? Easterbrook? Okay, he wrote a book. It was a really good book, I read it, I just can't remember the title. And in the book, he went through and he said he has the most boring, uninteresting story you'd ever want to see. It turns out, he says, when you really dig into the facts, these environmental laws worked. He didn't really have much to criticize. He said clean water. 1973, a third of the miles of navigable waters in the country were fishable and swimmable. That's our measure for a clean river. He said by the mid-1990s it was 2/3. Clean Water Act worked. Clean Air Act. You had very elevated lead levels in cities all around the country, including through sales of lead in gasoline. And lead does really bad things to kids, like lower their IQ permanently. So presumably we're not in favor of lead. We'd like to reduce lead. And the measurements on lead in the first decade after the Clean Air Act were dramatic reductions in lead. And when you look at the other environmental things under the Clean Air Act, you have dramatic reductions in a whole set of other environmental contaminants that were in people's lungs. Toxic chemicals, the idea that people would live on top of a Superfund site until Love Canal was discovered and we ended up with the Superfund law. We had toxic chemicals that were built up during the Industrial Revolution, scattered all over the place, very hard to clean up. We did two things. We had Superfund, which says the people who put it there should pay to clean it up. That's a sort of property right. You made the mess, you clean it up, if you want to think of it that way. And the second thing we did was have a series of rules about future toxic emissions, which basically incented the companies not to use toxics and to find non-toxic substitutes when they did their business. Turns out the load of toxic chemicals in the United States has fallen sharply over the last 30 years. That's a good thing. Fewer cases of cancer, a lot of that kind of stuff. You can argue about the cost, you can argue if we can do it better, you can argue about a lot of things. But this comprehensive study of the first 25 years of US environmental laws was Judge Easterbrook, Chicago School, Law and Economics brother, looked at it, said it's not what I thought I'd find. It turned out government has helped save the environment. And so that's a useful thing to put in your back of your mind as you're trying to consider going forward what the role of government should be.
Thank you. And Professor Swire did not use a term that you guys probably hear, we definitely hear in Washington, and I'm glad you didn't, but people like to use the word, when talking to folks criticizing climate legislation, they like to use the word denier, and they'll say science denier or climate denier, as if we're denying that there is climate, but really it's an attempt to evoke Holocaust denier. Because the idea is to say, this is so set in stone that if you are doubting any part of it, you are, evil or dumb or something. And one of the problems is that, what is this? And this is sort of a rule in writing. My editors always get back at me. I'll describe a bunch of things in one paragraph and begin the second paragraph with this. He says, what's this? So this, what might I be doubting about the rhetoric, the plans, the ideas of climate? I'll tell you what I'm not. Methane, CO2, other gases, all else being equal, make the atmosphere of the Earth warmer. Industrial activity adds to the concentration of methane and CO2 and other so-called greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Both of those things are true. The atmosphere getting warmer will cause some bad things to happen and could possibly cause some very bad things to happen. So I'll grant all of those things. I'm not denying climate change. I know very few people who do. Well, I know lots of people who do, because I go around to bars and I talk to random Joes and I don't tell them my opinions, I just hear it. So you hear people denying all sorts of things. Like that our president was born in Hawaii, or other things they want to deny for no good reason. But no, I don't deny those things, and I don't know well-educated people who do. What I deny, at first, yes, is that our government has the ability to dramatically reduce CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere without imposing huge economic costs. If you take the biggest, the most ambitious attempt at curbing greenhouse gas emissions, which was the Kyoto Protocol, and you take some of the predictions from the UN on sea level rise, somebody found that instead of, I forget now the exact numbers, but I'll get the proportions right, that the UN was predicting a 2-foot sea level rise over 100 years, but the Kyoto Protocol fully implemented over 100 years, reductions levels met, and the most ambitious proposals would have made that instead of there being a 2-foot sea level rise, we would have gotten a 1-foot, 11¼ sea level rise. And that's imposing lots of costs on the economy. So if you want to roll back, and if you talk to environmentalists who are not politicians, they will tell you this, if you really want to keep the greenhouse gas concentrations back to old levels, 1990 levels, that's basically impossible without a massive deindustrialization of the world. In other words, you've got China and India coming online, growing their economies. People now are getting